Good evening and welcome to Coalition for Conservation's Biodiversity and Sustainability Forum. I'm Cristina Talaco, the chair of C4C, and I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Tonight is a very special night for all of us, and the purpose of our webinar is to provide a forum for discussions on the value of the environment to our society and the economy, and also the important role that legislation has for that long-term success of Australia in food and water security, in farming, in tourism, and even in job creation. So this is a really important time to have these discussions. As we all know, we've experienced the single greatest biomass loss and the highest rates of mammal extinction in Australia's history during the bushfire season. And we are also in the midst of enacting amendments to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC. So the EPBC Amendment Bill and Graham Samuel's final report are coming, including recommendations on the 31st of October. The changes to the EPBC Act that are happening now will see us through to 2030, and potentially it will be the most vital decade of the Act's life. So it's important to understand how we can effectively pull this off, balancing costs, climate threats, pandemics, and also that extra challenge we have of this shared but divided responsibility in a federal system. Now we'll also hear from our panelists about bushfire recovery, environmental markets, circular economy, what industry is doing, and how policy and programs can be set to enhance the work that industry is doing. It's my pleasure to then introduce one of our panelists who's here already, and most of you know Niall Blair. Niall is a former New South Wales MLC who was also Minister for Primary Industries, Minister for Trade and Minister for Water. He was also Deputy Leader of New South Wales Nationals. And right now he's a Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University, an extremely important area for Australia's food security. Welcome, Niall. You're muted now.
How's that?
Much better.
Had a dollar for every time I did that. I wouldn't need to be working, but anyway. Thank you, and I'm happy just to fill in a bit of time until the Minister gets back on track, because I was really looking forward to listening to the Minister as well. But what I just wanted to quickly touch on was what I'm seeing happening in industry at the moment, particularly centred around our food production, and how that's directly related to sustainability and also biodiversity, and making sure that we get the balance right. At the moment, I'm working on a number of research projects that are being driven by multinational food companies. And I guess that's the first place to start, is that anything that we need to do in the space of sustainability isn't necessarily being driven by our domestic markets. It's being driven by our overseas trading partners, and also the people that sit in the boardrooms or are the shareholders of those companies that are demanding that the goods that they're either processing or that they're consuming need to be sustainably produced. And they've worked right through their supply chain within their businesses, and now they've ended up on farm, particularly here in Australia. So most of the companies that are trading globally have either signed up to the Paris Agreement, or they are working towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there's no debate about whether climate and those sort of areas are things that they are still considering. They're well and truly working towards reducing emissions and being more sustainable in their whole supply chain. So that's ended us up on farm here in Australia, working with these multinational companies to provide incentives to our farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because we know that in some of these businesses, between 40 and 80%, now that's a large number, and a large variance, but between 40 and 80% of their greenhouse gas emissions are actually coming from the farms that produce their base commodities. So we're working with them to improve their soil quality, put more organic matter back into the soils, reduce synthetic fertilizers, and also try and then make sure that they are capturing more carbon into the soil, and as a result reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's just one aspect of the things that we're working with these companies. The other area is trying to reduce waste and move away from a linear economy, particularly in the food and fibre production sector, to a circular economy. So making sure that we remove waste right through, again, the production phases, looking at how we can generate everything from energy to other products coming from that waste, and not looking at waste anymore as something that's discarded. It's looking at it as the building blocks for the next types of products that we're going to use, either in generating energy for traditional markets, or looking at whole new products again. And that's where we're seeing some of the most exciting advancements in things like packaging, using bioplastics and things like that, can all be derived from waste from some of our other production systems. And a lot of this is leaning towards how farmers are viewed and how they're trying to get that balance right when it comes to things like sustainability and biodiversity. A few weeks ago, I was involved in a presentation in the Netherlands, which is looking at actually increasing the biodiversity in a traditional cropping setting. And rather than just planting whole paddocks of wheat, for example, like we do here traditionally in Australia, you might do one paddock of wheat, maybe another paddock of canola. They're actually now introducing strips of each of those different crops in the same paddock. And the idea is to try and get different types of biodiversity, not the traditional native biodiversity, but the other types of bugs and organisms that may grow in those different crops, to actually coexist side by side. And I think the most exciting area that we're working on at the moment is not above ground biodiversity, but looking at how we can improve our soils and our soil biodiversity. I think for too long we've seen soils in this country not viewed as a living organism. And I think this is where we're starting to see some of the best advancements in research and how we can have a bigger impact on managing the environment in Australia. Finally, the other thing that I guess we're looking at, particularly through a lot of our research, is the whole concept of stewardship. It's wonderful to see some of the programs that the federal government is looking about how we can provide another income stream for farmers to maybe not even farm. So these are the sort of conversations that we'll have going forward, where we'll probably see a category of occupation called a land steward. And I believe those land stewards may produce food, they may produce fibre, or they may choose to actually take some form of funding for biodiversity conservation, and also doing things like offsets when it comes to things like sequestering carbon into the soil. So this is, I think, what we're starting to see a bit of a shift in the Australian farming sector. I think it provides many different options from our farmers, and a lot of it is being driven by the consumers and the boardrooms that we're trading with around the world. We've just seen what China has come out and said in relation to meeting and reducing greenhouse gas targets, and we're even having some of our ports asking some of our traditional suppliers how sustainable are the products that they're supplying, because these ports are under foreign ownership at the moment. That's a very quick snapshot of what's happening at the moment. I think the beauty is that we have the research that's backing this up here in Australia. We are world leading in some of these areas, and if we continue to be smart, we can not just export the commodities like we have, but also the ideas and how to do them more sustainably here in Australia.
Before we open to the Q&A, we have two more speakers, and I'll ask Martin Wilder to speak next, because he can talk a little bit about natural capital investment opportunities, which fits into what you were saying. And I'll introduce Martin. For those who don't know, he's the CEO of Pollination Group, which is a climate change advisory and investment firm that has recently signed a major contract with HSBC worth $4.15 billion in a green investment deal. He's also the president of the World Wildlife Fund Australia and a former chair of ARENA. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks very much, Christina. So I think I was just asked to give a few perspectives on the investment side of nature, and I think since the Paris Agreement was signed, there's been an increasing focus on a lot of governments talking about globally, how do we protect nature, how do we finance nature, how do we drive more capital into that area. And I think traditionally, with the exception of carbon and, for example, schemes in Australia like the ERF, and the Australian government's legislation, which creates a formal carbon offset with an ACCU. Around the world, there's still been a struggle to how do you value nature as an asset class. And so the joint venture that we've got in with HSBC is really an attempt to put towards investment in nature around $6 billion over the next sort of 5 or 6 years, Australian dollars or US dollars, and to try to really work out a way to really start financing our natural capital. So the theory is that basically you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy natural capital base. And if you overexploit your fisheries and you overexploit your landscapes and you don't manage them in a sustainable way, then you ultimately will not succeed. And I think secondly, as one of the questions on the Q&A has raised, is that if you also don't do so in a way that responds to what is a fairly rapid change in the climate, you'll also struggle enormously. So in adopting this, what we've really done is set up a platform to basically build funds. And the first fund will basically work with sovereign governments and sovereign wealth funds to invest in what we call natural capital. And we define the natural capital space as regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, sustainable fisheries, water, biodiversity and wildlife. Now, in the short term, it's much easier to invest in areas like regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry, but it's more difficult to invest at the other end of the spectrum, biodiversity and wildlife. But as you do these more traditional investments, you can start to actually incorporate into them ways of farming and ways of undertaking your activities that actually benefit biodiversity and benefit water and benefit wildlife, so that over the next 5 to 10 years, the hope will be that they actually will emerge as their own independent asset class. So one of the things that we have, that the whole venture here is meant to do, is to drive capital of a sufficient scale that these will emerge as an asset class that's investable. And interestingly, since we've done that, there's been a number of other announcements, like Prince Charles, through his trust, has announced trying to get $100 billion into funding funds that fund nature. We're seeing a number of other people trying to get in this space, and that is very good, because the more capital that moves into this area, then you create a market and you create more interest. Two of the things, though, in talking to a lot of the sovereign wealth funds and the investors that we've spoken to, are that critical to succeeding in this is, one, being based on the very best available science. So making sure that when you're assessing landscapes and you're trying to invest in nature, that your metrics are the best they can be. So many investors say, yes, we would like a good return, but equally important to us is demonstrating to us that the investment you make actually does have a real benefit for biodiversity. And so in that sense, what we've embarked on is a pretty ambitious program, but at the same time, what we're seeing is, as a lot of the world's capital gets out of fossil fuels and is looking for a new home, nature is important, not only because it provides an alternative way to invest, it's also an uncorrelated asset class. And also many of the insurance companies we work with see that as a core focus of climate resilience. So if you're, for example, investing in reef systems or mangroves that can actually form a barrier to coastal erosion, that in itself helps reduce insurance premiums. So what we're really trying to do is bring together all these different dynamics that put a value on nature, and then will drive the investment class. I think also the other important thing to state is that at the moment, this comes off the back of what is a pretty significant global push in this direction. So you might have seen that HSBC recently released a very large report on global biodiversity and how do you finance that gap of investing in biodiversity. Many of you will be aware of the TCFD, which is a task force for financial climate disclosure. Interestingly, that task force has driven a huge amount of change globally, but particularly in Europe. But there's now emerging a task force for nature financial disclosure. And exactly what that task force will seek companies to disclose is still the matter of debate. but it's gaining significant momentum at the moment. So, and finally, we're also seeing a huge global focus on biodiversity. And so again, you know, what the sovereign wealth funds are trying to work out is how do you invest in this space and get a return. And so that really is the challenge. And the more that we can drive capital in this space, and the more we can focus things on alternative farming, like regenerative agriculture, like what Niall was talking about, particularly on water. I mean, water is one of our greatest unspoken challenges in the world, with many cities getting very close to running out of water. And we have to find new ways to do that. And a core focus to a lot of this is also technology. How do you embed technology into the process, whether it's through collecting data, satellite imaging, through better water production and conservation. So that's really the journey that we've been on. And Australia is key to this. I mean, Australia is one of the leaders in regenerative agriculture. And so therefore our ability to basically invest in that space, capitalize on it and take it internationally is very important. And what we're also seeing at the moment is a lot of countries are also realizing that they have a very strong natural capital base that can be monetized. And whether you do that through carbon in soils, whether you do that through carbon in forests, whether you do that through other bases, these international agreements make provision for that. So in the same way in the past that we've exported coal or exported oil, coal or exporting gas, there's an incredible opportunity for us to also export some of our basically investments in nature, as well as our intellectual property in that space. And we have some of the leading thinking around how you value nature at the moment. So I think I'll leave it there, but there's just some comments.
Thank you very much, Martin. And we'll now hear from Professor Dr. Peter Burnett, the Honorary Associate Professor at the ANU College of Law. The professor researches Australian environmental law and policy, including the EPBC, and the role of environmental accounting in policy integration. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Christina. I wanted to briefly address 3 questions tonight. Firstly, why is conserving biodiversity so hard? Secondly, what might we do about this from a broad policy point of view? And thirdly, is Professor Samuel, with his review of the EPBC Act, heading in the right direction? Well, firstly, why is conserving biodiversity so hard? It's hard to even get off the starting plate with biodiversity, because it's hard to pin down exactly what it is or why it's important. It's also hard because nature operates in a systemic way, or as one famous ecologist put it, everything's connected to everything else. And this connectedness has implications for decision making. It means that local decisions, even something quite straightforward as approving a housing estate, for example, can be significant at a much larger scale. That might be because the area concerned is a significant piece in a larger ecological jigsaw. For example, a local wetland might turn out to be a waypoint for a migratory species. But even if there's not something really special about it, at a minimum, all these local decisions with local impacts have cumulative effects. And this means we're chipping away at the environment, often without knowing where the tipping points are. In the 1960s, there was an American economist called Alfred Kahn. He called this problem of cumulative effects the tyranny of small decisions. And environmentalists sometimes call it the death of 1,000 cuts, but whatever you call it, it means that biodiversity needs a different kind of decision-making to what we're used to, one that's holistic and integrated. Conservation of biodiversity is also hard because of the biophysical facts of nature being in tension with our human nature. As humans, we generally conduct our affairs by negotiation. We make trade-offs. Because nature's biophysical, it can't negotiate. So, for example, if we as a society think that we're striking the right balance with, say, a forest and keeping 20% of the original area of the forest, and that strikes the right balance between conservation and development, that's fine. But if nature says, no, you actually need to conserve 30% for the forest to survive, then 30% it is. Also, humans tend to focus on the immediate, whereas many environmental impacts are long-term, indeed intergenerational. So in short, conservation biodiversity is very hard. It's hard to pin down even what it is we're talking about, what we're trying to achieve, we've got limited information, limited understanding, and some of the decisions required go against the grain for us. So to my second question, what could we do about this from a policy point of view? Well, I wanted to highlight three things. Of course, there's a lot we could do, but three things in particular. Firstly, I think we could get a much better understanding of our natural assets. We need comprehensive national information systems. We don't have those. I mean, we obviously have a lot of knowledge, but we don't have true comprehensive national systems. And I'm not just talking about gathering lots of data, but organising information in a way that informs good decision making. In particular, I would advocate doing this through environmental accounting at all scales, because this enables us to measure our stocks of natural capital and also the flows of ecosystem services. And just as an aside, I think this natural capital model is the biggest advance we've had in the last 25 years in environmental policy. Second thing we could do, take a more comprehensive approach to a policy at all levels. So not just setting high-level policy goals, although that's important as well, but also setting bottom lines, multiple bottom lines, for various ecosystems and species, etc. I would call these rules for natural capital adequacy. In other words, we'll be trying to answer the question at all levels, how much nature is enough? Generally, we don't do much of this at the moment. What we tend to do is to focus on the process of decision making, on ticking the boxes and saying we've considered various things, but we don't focus too much on the bottom lines. And I think we do need to shift that focus. We need to complement this by regional environmental plans so that we're not just setting bottom lines in the abstract, but positioning those bottom lines within a landscape context to give everybody certainty about what can and can't be done in particular areas. And we'd also need, I think, to address this with a new Commonwealth State compact or agreement about a shared approach to conserving nature. We've got a couple of agreements in this area, but they date way back to the 1990s and they're long out of date. If we had all these things, if we had comprehensive information and accounts, and we had rules of capital adequacy, we knew what we were trying to achieve, then the third thing I'd suggest is we could actually manage biodiversity like you manage a budget. You'd be working out what does the bottom line need to look like and how can we turn that bottom line into reality? Where do we need to target our investments, for example? So to my third question, and finally, do I think Graham Samuel is heading in the right direction with his review of the EPBC Act? Well, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, Christina, of course, we haven't seen his final report yet. It's not due till the end of the month, but we did see an interim report a couple of months ago. And I think there's a lot to welcome from a policy perspective in the directions that he has, Professor Samuel's laid out. Three in particular, I would highlight. Firstly, his recommendation for a quantum shift on environmental information and specifically a single national source of truth. That's his phrase. I take him to mean a national institution to look after environmental information and also an integrated national information supply chain, joining it all together. He recommends, secondly, that environmental law, certainly at the national level, but I think it's applicable at all levels, rest on a foundation of national environmental standards and complemented by regional and sometimes national environmental plans. I think, again, this is definitely a good direction to be heading in. And finally, he's said that we need to do much better in engaging with Indigenous Australians and drawing on their traditional knowledge. And I think the disaster at Juukan Gorge in the Pilbara a few months ago has really brought this home to everybody in a very public way. I think I probably have some differences in emphasis from him. I'll probably be going further down the natural capital track than he seems to be suggesting at the moment, although as I said, it's only an interim report at this stage and we haven't seen his final recommendations. He has recommended that we take a pathway to devolving Commonwealth level project-based decision making to the states, including what he calls a strong independent cop on the beat to enforce the standards that would be put in place. I generally agree or I'm comfortable with that as a direction, and certainly It's important to gain the efficiency benefits from reducing duplication. But I think I probably would disagree with him on the pace of change, because he's saying, oh, we could set some interim standards and get into the accreditation fairly early. I've got a couple of problems with that. One is, I think it's very hard, once you set interim standards, it's hard then to ratchet them up, as I think he's suggesting we do. He uses the phrase increasing granularity, but I think that inevitably also means raising the bar, and I think it's hard to do that politically. It's also hard to measure the implementation of standards in the short to medium term. We just don't have the information. So while I'm comfortable with the direction he's recommending, I'd see it as more of a medium to longer term exercise rather than a short term exercise. So just in conclusion, the environment's a tough gig. We've had lots of policy failures over the last 50 years since modern governments really sort of started putting their noses to the grindstone on this. We keep getting reports that say things are getting worse. So obviously we need to do better. And I think Professor Samuel is heading in the right direction. If I could just make one plea to the government, however, this is a once in a decade opportunity. So I'd respectfully urge the government to take its time in developing a comprehensive response to this important report, and also that the response that is developed be done in partnership with the states. I think it's almost impossible for a federal government to go it alone. We've had a couple of failed attempts at Commonwealth state partnerships on the environment, and I think it's really time to revisit that, and it's essential that we make it work. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter. So I'll open to the Q&A now. There's so many questions, and I think as you spoke a little bit about science and the importance of reviewing the Act in a way that it will be long-term for Australia, I might open with a question from Belinda, which says, how can Australia better incorporate scientific findings in environmental policy? Our local environmental scientists often provide advice that doesn't seem to influence decision-making at times.
I'd like to comment, please, Christina. I think we've been very good at the research side of the science, of environmental science. Australia does have an excellent record. I don't think we've been so good at the routine observation side of science. I would mention in particular routine baseline biodiversity monitoring. So this is monitoring that's not necessarily aimed at discovering anything new, but more just making sure that we are observing on an ongoing and comprehensive basis what's going on out there. Governments at several points in the last 20 or 30 years have made commitments to do comprehensive baseline monitoring going back right to the 1990s, but it's never really come to fruition. And I think it's still a very significant gap in our science. And to go back to the question, which is about linking the science to the decisions, and this was the point I was making about using environmental accounts to draw the information together. It's not just about having the data, it's about organising it in a way that actually assists good decision making. And so we really need more effort, I think, in routine environmental monitoring and observation, and then the feeding of all that information into systems that can inform good decision making.
Thank you. There's a question here on habitat disturbance, and they're talking about land clearing being the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And most land clearing is for agriculture. So how can we quickly shift the incentives so it's more profitable to maintain or restore habitat on farmland rather than to convert it to livestock and crops? Who wants to have a go?
I'm happy to have a go at that one, because I think that's certainly what we're looking forward to seeing in the future. And if we look at the opportunities that natural capital investment in itself provide, I think that's what I was speaking about in my short presentation. I think that our land stewards will have a range of decisions in the future that won't just be about farming. And I think that been able to do offsets or manage biodiversity, or separate to even looking at soil capture, I think is an exciting area. And then linking those, almost going back to the previous question, linking those sciences. In the future, I think that if you look at a traditional agriculture course now and an environmental course now, in the future, I think you'll see very little difference probably in the first 2 years of those courses at a university, because it will be all around understanding and managing the natural assets. And then it will be the decision points from there and knowing how to potentially switch between the two, or to utilise them for food and fibre production. And that will then mean also potentially rethinking about where we farm, how we farm, and even looking at one of the projects we're doing at the moment is using spatial data to understand paddock by paddock, so that we can actually then get the best performing parts of the farm maybe under food production, but the least performing parts can maybe return back for native vegetation and for biodiversity offsetting. So I think that is a really exciting future that we see, and that will address those broader issues of that traditional monoculture, clear crop, and away we go. I think we'll see more integrated and sophisticated systems in the future.
Thank you, Niall. Martin, how can we overcome the fact that Australia's native forests aren't currently eligible for carbon sequestration funding to keep them standing instead of being logged?
I actually answered that. I typed the answer. But I think the short answer to that question is that that is actually, I think, a work in progress. The government has actually been looking at that. I mean, that prohibition really stems from the old MIS schemes, when there was a lot of managed investment schemes in Australia, and those were monocultures and they were not considered to be additional, which is why they were ruled out. There is a revisiting of that at the moment to have a look at what's feasible and what's possible. The government is entertaining some dialogue on that. So I think, though, they do still need to be biodiverse forests, or you need to move more towards biodiverse. So, on something like State Forests of Victoria, that's a very large asset base, which quite frankly cost the government a huge amount of money. And if they were to be more innovative in the way that they manage that estate and they flip it into a biodiverse estate, then it would actually be feasible to generate carbon through that. It would require a change of rules, but we need to look at things in a different light. And you can learn lessons from what New Zealand are doing around those sorts of assets. I mean, I think what a lot of this discussion does, though, come back to is you really have to value nature. So you have to value, you have to put a real value on nature above politics and above development. And you really have a choice. Either the government funds it, as the Queensland government is doing through the Land Restoration Fund, where it will buy carbon, it will pay for nature-based outcomes and the like, or the private sector has to fund it. And you do that through valuing the land better. So, for example, you recognise the increased value of the land because of biodiversity and because of better soil values, etc., and the extent to which that occurs. And then you have to train valuers and banks to understand that this land is better because it has a better production. So a lot of this is tied up in, and also understanding that land clearing is bad. And if you clear land, it devalues the land and that has an economic impact. And so there are lots of drivers that can be used, but that is core to this. We've got, as we make observations and we get good data, from there we go to, working out how to value that.
Thanks. We have a couple of minutes. There's one to Martin. What can governments do to make it more attractive for investors to invest in natural capital?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. So first of all, to invest in natural capital, there are direct regulatory measures like the Climate Solutions Fund, the former ERF, the Queensland Government's LRF. They actually put a value on investing in natural capital. And those are direct interventionist policies that have been very successful, and they have driven huge amounts of investment into natural capital. The second one is using the tax system to do that. So if you improve land values through doing things like investing in natural capital, or you invest in biodiversity, then giving someone a tax benefit for doing so is another way you can do it. Another interesting one is for governments to raise natural capital bonds. So there's a lot of opportunity among the states and at the federal level to raise a bond that may drive investment into natural capital. We've seen that overseas. We work with BHP and the IFC actually on a bond to invest in a rainforest. It was meant to be in a number of countries, ended up being largely Kenya driven. And we're working on a $5 billion rainforest bond for Indonesia at the moment. So there is ways you can use innovative finance to drive investment into these sectors. That's very important. And ultimately, the one thing which everybody hates, but is true, is an ETS. And that was a question that was put up on the table. But an ETS, or increasing the safeguard mechanism tied in with the existing ERF, will drive more investment. Because the King Review demonstrated the importance of more supply, soil carbon, other parts, but what you need at the other side of that is demand. So you need to drive more demand. So there is an increasing global demand by companies to do this. Unilever just announced $1 billion investment in nature, as you would have, many people would have seen, but we need more than those corporate commitments. We actually also need legislative commitments. But there's pretty innovative stuff we can do using existing finance mechanisms, working with insurance companies, working with corporates to drive investment. And a great example of this would be blue carbon. So the government's working very hard on a methodology for blue carbon. I think it's 6 to 12 months away. That was one of the questions. Once that methodology comes out, the ability to invest in blue carbon, to generate ACCUs, to improve fisheries, to use the insurance benefits from that and wrap that into a bond structure as well, is another example of something that could be done.
Thank you, Martin. And the next question may be sort of still in that sort of same area. As time is of essence, if there is one project that could be accelerated by the private sector now, in tandem with government and using existing spatial data, what do you think it would be?
So I also put a response on that. I mean, there are a couple of things that could be done, but I'll give you one example, which we're working on at the moment, is a very large bond instrument for the Great Barrier Reef, whereby a lot of the farming practices up and down the coast, those farmers are subject to high interest rates, high debt ratios. If you could do a bond that would refinance a lot of those farms and then would help reduce the runoff and reduce fertilizer use and actually transition some of those farms to other agriculture, which many of them are asking for. And there's a project which WWF has been quite involved in called Quadrant. But to wrap a large financial mechanism around that where the private sector would invest, and this is a purely private sector economic return. The government can play a role through the ERF if it wished to, but even just using the option contracts, there are innovative things like that which could have a massive impact on the reef system, and it would bring communities together, Indigenous communities, local councils, federal and state governments, and private sector investors and insurance companies. So there are really interesting things like that which we could be looking at.
Thank you. There's a question for Niall. It's about synthetic fertilizers. Have you answered that one, Niall? Because if you have, I'll move on to another one.
Yeah.
If you have or you haven't?
Yeah, no, I put an answer to that one. I certainly still see a role for synthetic fertilizers. It's just a case of trying to be a bit reduced where possible and trying to look at other alternatives to put organic matter and also nutrients back into the soil is a short one.
Okay. I actually do have a question. I've been reading a lot about regenerative agriculture. What do you all think about the concept of regenerative agriculture?
Look, it's certainly definitely has a place, and we're seeing some fantastic stories coming from that. And even in, a lot of the universities are doing a lot more research, and you can even do courses now in this. We need a whole range of different systems. This country is so big with so many different soil types, so many different climatic zones. We need a range of farming practices that are continuing to evolve and challenge what we've just done over and over in some cases. And that's where I think the research fraternity can really come to its own. But the most important link with this is they have to be farmer driven, and farmers still need to be able to make a profit, but they also need to be part of this solution. See them as good stewards, help them understand what the problems are, and then work with them and policymakers to come up with some of the solutions, and the research will underpin it.
Thank you. Susan and also Professor Peter, I think I'll ask you this one. What needs to be done to give us the greatest success rate in protecting biodiversity and addressing the trajectory of decline and loss that we had, moving from crisis, shifting into recovery phase?
Rather than nominate any specific investment or program, my response to that would be, we've got to be consistent, and we've got to be persistent. So we need to identify the really useful things to do, the priority things, and then we need to make sure that they're enduring. One of the biggest problems we've had in environmental policy over the decades is we chop and change. Governments might come up with a good program and then the next government will get rid of it, or even the same government will get rid of it. So we've got to find ways of, once we work out what needs to be done, not only investing in it, but finding ways to institutionalise those investments and actions so that we keep going. This is a very long-term problem, and consistency and persistence is one of our biggest failings.
Thank you. Regarding this legislation and the EPBC and everything else in the future even, what will strengthen our legislation and our position in terms of protecting our biodiversity most, in your eyes, Minister? What should the reform's biggest priority?
I would just echo the comments around particularly data and making sure that there's good understanding if there are changes, and when there are changes, that particularly landholders understand them clearly and can clearly work within the boundaries and the guidelines and the system that comes out as a result, to, again, as I said, be part of the solution rather than at times always seem to be the problem. But I think I just echo particularly the data and the pragmatic approach that the Minister and the government is taking at the moment. I think will certainly pay dividends.
Thank you. Martin?
I just said, look, I totally agree with the Minister's comment on natural capital markets as are really, really important. I think also, though, we should be very cognizant of the need now to really focus on things like the precautionary principle. I mean, we have to have a clear risk assessment of climate risk and physical risk and transition risk in anything that we do with respect to nature. Every single business on the planet is just about taking into account climate risk in their decision making now. And this is, as I said at the outset, with TNFD moving on from TCFD, also taking into account the risk of losing nature. So those have to be paramount in any decision making that we do, and really taking that into account. And as I said, this is pretty common among all financial institutions today, and it's what the private sector is doing, and we shouldn't be risking our natural capital of this country if there's a real risk to the long-term future of that. Absolutely.
Professor?
Well, I would agree with what others are saying, that the standards, the information, the landscape approaches, they're all very important. It's the right direction. But the point I would make is that these things are much easier said than done. They require major and sustained investment. And so by government, but the argument I'd make is that government should make these investments on behalf of all of us. This is not just a bit of extra government spending. We really, as a society, need to get behind these directions and persuade government that this is a worthy area for major and ongoing investment.
As we've run out of time, I'd just like to say it was a pleasure to have this conversation, and I would love to invite now our C4C ambassador, the former Minister for the Environment, Robin Parker, just to do a vote of thanks and wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. It's absolutely been a delight to listen once again to C4C. It's always stimulating to listen to a panel. Today we've heard from a former minister and a current minister, both of whom have had challenging portfolios. I think have the capacity to get across huge diversity in their portfolios, but not only that, to bring diverse groups together to come up with solutions. We see with Minister Lee, whether it's an unexploded bomb in a marine park, and now we find out, I didn't know we had the second biggest network of parks in the world, but to different bird species, to marine species, but all of our participants today have talked about the value of nature, the circular economy, the importance of science, the importance of bringing people together, and the importance of research. Niall has gone on from politics to really talk to the farmers that he knows so well in terms of diversity, in terms of stewardship, in terms of ways in which we can really get the best value out of our agricultural economy. Martijn, many of you have probably met Martijn before. I've met him in the past. He is one of the world's leading climate lawyers. We are very lucky to have him in Australia. And I think he's been talking about these issues for a long time, and his time has come because companies and governments are listening, and as they should be listening to the capital value of investing in nature. Large companies, large governments really ought to, as we move to net zero, be thinking about these issues. It makes sense in every way. So thank you so much for your probing, your pushing of governments, of pushing of corporates in terms of your investment strategies. We really value that and value your contribution tonight. And to Peter, thank you for your analysis of Graham Samuel's work and understanding of how important it is that we get the legislation right, that everybody works together to have the best outcomes. So, you know, to have a minister here typing away answers to all of us goes to show that C4C once again has brought a great group of people together, and we're able to ask questions like this. We're very fortunate. So thank you everyone on the panel, and thank you C4C for a great night and a stimulating discussion.
Thank you very much, Robin. And just before we close, I just want to invite everyone who's attending tonight to our next webinar. It's on the 19th of October, so next Monday, and we'll have the UK State Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, Kwasi Kwarteng, in a panel, not a panel, but a discussion or a conversation with the member for Wentworth, Dave Sharma. And then we're also hosting on the 18th November, our Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor. So hopefully you can all participate again. Thanks, Professor Peter, Martijn, and Niall. It was enlightening to all of us. And hopefully we'll have a second one after the PBC Act, perhaps in a couple of months, and after you know, the whole thing is all done. So please sign up on our website if you haven't yet, and I wish you all a great night. Stay safe, have a good night. Bye.